Welcome back, everybody. In today's lecture, we're going to be examining some of the more specific areas of cognitive development that occur. Essentially, we're going to be looking at some of the stuff that we alluded to in the previous module. We're really digging into specific terms and concepts that relate to the cognitive growth that we undergo from infancy into adulthood, and we'll also be able to spend some time talking about what happens once we reach adulthood as well. If we're going to understand various aspects of cognitive psychology, there's a concept that we first want to become familiar with. It's this idea of something called information processing. What cognitive psychologists argue is that at the heart of most of our actions in the environment is a stimulus response relationship. And for us to transition from encountering a stimulus to actually responding to it, there's a step by step process that we engage in. First step in this information processing process is this process of what we call attenuation, the ability to focus our attention, to commit mental resources to the stimulus that we'd like to eventually respond to. A key element to this attention step is the process of what's called encoding, finding ways to convert what it is we're experiencing, both the stimuli and the environment, into something that our mind can make sense of. This eventually leads to the next step along the way, which is called memory. Memory is very multifaceted, and we're going to actually spend a considerable amount of time in the next lecture talking about all the different components to memory that are critical players in this information processing experience. The last thing that's often tied to this information processing experience is the last step called thinking, where we're able to come up with a response based on past memories and our understanding of what it is we're encountering. These ideas are something that are going to be revisited time and time again in this lecture and the next lecture. In addition to talking about these concepts, though, we have to remind ourselves that we are in a lifespan development class. So we're not just going to talk about all the nuances to thinking and memory and attention. We're also going to talk about how these things are very clearly tied to aging. We're also going to talk about a key element that's kind of overarching around all of these different steps in the information processing process. This overarching idea is something called automaticity. Essentially, our ability to do one of these cognitive processes or all of these processes smoothly. What we see with research is not only do we develop specific elements to all of the different skills that we're going to be talking about at different ages, but the ability to do these skills becomes more or less automatic depending upon our age. In fact, when talking about automaticity and speed, what we tend to discuss is this U-shaped curve that seems to pop up with most of our cognitive abilities. Not necessarily all. We'll look at some exceptions to that as we progress. But for the most part, especially with things like attention, we do see that we tend to go up in automaticity in lots of different attention skills and then down in our latter years of life. So let's focus in on that idea of automaticity a little bit more. Talking about how attention becomes more automatic, we have to understand that there's a multitude of different types of attention that we can become better and better at. One of the first and most important types of attention that we eventually gain the ability to use is this concept called sustained attention. Essentially, sustained attention is our ability to maintain our attention on something of interest. In the beginning, sustained attention is just essentially how long you can pay attention to whatever's in front of you. But as time progresses, sustained attention becomes more nuanced because it gets tied into the other types of attention that are critical in human experience. Another element of attention that's very closely tied to sustained attention over time is this concept called selective attention, where we not only can maintain our attention in something, but we can actually focus on what it is we want to focus on while ignoring some of the peripheral things. And This also relates to a third thing that's really critical called executive attention, where we're not only able to block out things and catch that thing that we want to focus on, but we can control and allocate our attention resources throughout an experience. So we can say, pay attention to a lecture while blocking out things in the periphery. And then when we want to turn our attention to something in the periphery, we can do that. One final type of attention that's sometimes discussed, and we'll look at the very end of this lecture, is this concept of something called divided attention, a theoretical ability to focus on multiple things. Automaticity and divided attention often get tied to each other simply because for us to be able to do multiple things, automaticity might need to be there. But we're going to, in the end, talk about how this very last step in attention is something that maybe is filled with lots of misnomers. But before I ruin the end of the story, let's look at the beginning. Let's start at birth and talk about what we have at our disposal with respect to attention at that moment in our life. When we're born, what we tend to see is that even though we can't direct our attention to specific things, we can't block out other things, infants do have some semblance of attention within the very first few weeks after birth. When we're talking about attention, what we're really just talking about is kind of some level of alertness that's raised that allows the brain to process something new in the environment. To understand attention at young ages, what we often talk about are these terms called habituation and dishabituation. Most infants display their first attentional skills when they experience something novel, when they're essentially dishabituated to something in their environment. And that novelty, that new experience, can draw an infant to something for a number of, well, usually seconds. Minutes is probably stretching it, but that sustained attention of a couple seconds, we believe, is really critical in the early rudimentary development of later cognitive skills. Eventually, though, the child becomes habituated to that new things, and their attention is either drawn elsewhere or it just kind of turns off, and they're in that basic processing mode that many infants are in during the vast majority of their early childhood. At about 3 months, though, infants start to develop, again, what we call selective attention, where they might not be able to control what it is they're paying attention to, but they can block out some things that are kind of distracting them. This selective attention is limited. It's not really powerful because the executive attention skill isn't there. But what it can allow infants to do for about 6 months or so is pay attention to something that they want to pay attention to for roughly 5 to 10 seconds without constantly being bombarded by other things that are instantly distracting them. And that again initiates another growth in cognitive development because of how important attention is to things like language development, memory, and even the basic processes of sensation and our motor skills. As we get a little bit older, another attention skill starts to pick up. This concept of something called joint attention, where infants are able to, for the very first time, recognize multiple things at once. This isn't necessarily the equivalence of multitasking. It's more just the ability to process a multitude of things that we're paying attention to. What most researchers have shown is that about 8 months in, as we've been able to sustain our attention longer and longer, children start to display the ability to, say, pay attention to a parent and something that that parent is looking at, or look at multiple elements of their environment at the exact same time. And this eventually leads the infants into the ability of doing something called gaze following. And gaze following, we believe, is critical for language development. Because once it's there, infants can quickly pick up on the meaning of certain things. A great example of this is if I say, pointed at the picture to the right and said Blorg without anything more. If I did that, you might hear the word Blorg and see the picture, but you'd have no idea what Blorg actually was. You could be talking about the four legs, the stripes, the teeth, the eye. There's a multitude of different things that could be tied to this concept of Blorg. Heck, it could be the whole animal or whatever it is in the picture. But if a child was able to follow my gaze, which is kind of tough to do over this recording, but let's say a child was able to follow my gaze and watch me pointing at or looking at the stripes in the back of this animal, they could quickly deduce that Blorg related to those stripes. It could be a term for hair, it could be a term for something on the top of the animal, but at least they've narrowed down what Blorg could actually mean. And this is the intuitive value of gaze following. We don't think it's just coincidence that language skills dramatically increase at about the same time this particular type of attention develops. And it leads oftentimes to other issues that can suddenly be solved. We're looking at where this particular skill really is highlighted. We often see is most children that struggle at about a year of age tend to not be able to engage in these joint attention skills at, well, about this time. One classic example of kids that have struggled with attention skills is something that relates to a mental health issue, well, actually more just a developmental issue called autism or Asperger's disease. Well, actually nowadays we call it the autism spectral disorder. We tend to see as kids that are developing symptoms or behavioral cues related to this developmental disorder, they tend to not engage in this gaze following at the same time as a lot of their peers. The belief is that this is one of the first things that starts to separate them out from their peers in terms of interpersonal skills and some of the early developmental things that other kids and parents take for granted. So even though it might seem like just a small step, many people believe that this is one of the critical skills that's developed at about a year, and it highlights how important attention is. Now, by the time children reach early childhood, a lot of the basic elements of attention are already present. But what's not present is really a robust ability to engage effectively in a lot of these attention skills. That's why for approximately 3 to 5 years, most of children's focus is not on necessarily developing new attention skills, but really building on the ones that are present. What we see is the sustained attention of many children from about 3 until 6 or 7 is dramatically increased. And that's tied to the ability to not only pay attention in school, but the ability to pay attention in a lot of different scenarios. Many parents find that they're frustrated when they try to sit a 2 or 3 year old down in front of a television and have them watch just one show as a distraction. What's odd is that just a year or two later, when they're 4 or 5, most kids can not only sit down and watch an entire show, but they can watch an entire series of shows or watch an entire movie. And that transition is not just magical, this is often tied to the increased ability for children to sustain attention throughout an entire video or through an entire class or some experience that they're going through. And something paired up with this is the child's ability to not only block out things, but really decide what they want to pay attention to. Essentially is tied to that executive attention skill that's starting to pop up in late infancy, but really becomes much better by the time children reach around 4, 5, 6 years of age. As these skills are developing, though, there are still some things that have quite a ways to go. One thing that kids, even at the age of 5 or 6, struggle with is this idea of something called salience recognition. So they might be able to pay attention to a movie or a teacher in class, but their ability to derive what they really need to remember, what the key elements that require extra attention to are, is still not very good. And it's not until kids get into their late childhood years that we start to see a display of an uptick in salience recognition. If you're wondering what this means for young kids, essentially, you might encounter a lot of frustration when you're around 4 or 5-year-olds. You might watch a movie and they'll talk about the favorite part of the movie, which happened to be just some random scene that had nothing to do with the plot line. Or if you ask a child about what they learned in school or what the point of a story was, they oftentimes pick up on some very random, odd things as the main points. And this relates to another critical element to attention that we think is sort of tied to executive attention, but sort of is on its own. This concept of something called planfulness. The ability of a child to kind of pay attention to certain elements of the things that they're looking at, and in doing so, kind of put extra effort in the things that are critical. Since kids struggle still to understand the critical, they also tend to struggle with following certain aspects of a story or plot line. Now, it can result in some really interesting things. Children, when they're read books, will often not necessarily follow along with the plot line the way you would expect them to, but they might find quirky, weird things in the story that you completely missed. One of my favorite examples of this is when teachers read storybooks with pictures in it to young kids, and kids will consistently point out random things within pictures or random elements to the pages that the reader never would have attended to. It shows sort of a lack of attention skills, but also how if you're not following a certain path of thinking and paying attention to things, you might be able to pick up on some rather random and obscure bits of information that can be fun to pick up on. Now, to understand, though, how important it is to be able to draw our attention from thing to thing, I thought I'd give you one real life example that really can kind of hit home and how this planfulness is really important in our daily lives. What you see in front of you is two pictures that are fairly identical. If you pause it for a second, you'll notice there's, I believe, roughly 6 or 7 completely different things to these two pictures. If you can find them, more on you. This shows that your planfulness is probably pretty good. And it shows that you can actually not only have attention going from one thing to another, but really have a strategy in place as you're transitioning your attention from one thing to another. For 5, 6-year-olds, this is a very challenging task. It's not until we again get to the very end of childhood, very beginning really of adolescence, that these planfulness skills start to develop and we're able to do tasks like this that we kind of take for granted as adults. But it's important to note here that as we're getting into adolescence, not all things suddenly become perfect. Yes, our executive attention, our ability to control what we're paying attention to and what we're blocking out greatly enhances throughout all of adolescence. We also get much better at salience recognition so we can identify the key elements to stories and classes and how to even tell stories much more effectively. But what we often see with teenagers or adolescents is that they tend to kind of overestimate their attention skills. One of the things that many adolescents start to engage in is this process of what we call multitasking, trying to do multiple things at the same time. What we see is that adolescents are actually very often really crummy with multitasking. You might have been one of those people that love to listen to music while doing homework or love to have a television on in the background while you were working on the piano or some other task. And please understand, I'm not trying to knock on you when I say this, but odds are pretty good that you did those things significantly worse because you had those extra stimuli present in your environment. It's not that you can't do those things, but your ability to do those things drops. And this relates actually back to the concept that we talked about earlier, this idea of automaticity. The only time we can really multitask effectively is if we're engaging in a task that's almost entirely automatic. Classic example of this is being able to read while doing another task. Doesn't mean that we can process necessarily what we're reading, but because our brains, by the time we're adolescents, are so pre programmed to convert the symbols of letters into words, we do it without thinking. The thinking part, though, will always take energy. The processing of that story, the processing of the music that we're listening to, cannot happen at the same time without some cost. And as adolescents, we work on developing that skill, and we are admittedly better at it to an extent, but we're never great at it. And this is almost always tied to the inability for us to multitask unless that task that we're doing is truly automatic. And once we get past adolescence, there is still some time for growth. What most research has shown is actually our attention skills work all the way or increasing all the way until late adulthood. That means until you're around 40, 50 years old, you're continually getting better and better at your attention skills. Once you're in your mid 40s, we tend to see this kind of leveling off of attention skills. Not a drop in attention skills, mind you, but a leveling off of attention skills that persist for usually a decade or two. It's also important to note that when we talk about this peak, what many researchers have highlighted is that there are a ton of differences, individual differences, on a person's attention skills. Some people, through effortful work, develop very good attention skills that can allow them to maintain their attention for long times and control exactly what it is they're paying attention to, while others never really refine these skills. This could be related to developmental issues, but oftentimes it's more related to environmental factors. Another shout out, I guess, to Lev Vygotsky and his stressing of how important the environment is when we're developing cognitive skills. As we get older and get into very late adulthood, we're talking 60s, 70s, and beyond, we do start to see a small drop in our attention skills. These drops, though, are kind of minimal for most individuals. Our divided attention skills do get worse, not that they were ever really good in the beginning, and our ability to recognize the importance of specific environments and things that we're experiencing, what we call salience recognition, does drop just a little bit when we get older. Our sustained attention drops a little bit. And what we tend to see is a lot of these drops, not necessarily because we're losing the skills themselves as much as our brain just isn't processing things quite the same way. Numerous studies have actually shown that if we control for lacks of stimulation or degenerative diseases, most people don't see any cognitive declines in attention until maybe the 80s or 90s. And even then, a lot of these declines are fairly minimal. It really highlights the importance of keeping yourself active, both physically and mentally, if you want to keep this particular skill, which is critical, again, in the information processing experience, really functioning at its highest level. A chance to really cover the nuances of this first step in information processing and really get a sense of all the different elements to it. We're going to be able to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to move on in the next video to looking at the memory processes and the thinking processes that round out information processing. Hopefully you get a lot from this. If you need a review, please do. I know we threw a number of terms at you in this one, but if all is good, I'll see you in the next video. Take care.